Welcome everybody to this meeting on the upcoming negotiations on the multilateral legal framework for sovereign debt restructuring processes. So welcome to all those who are in the room and also those who are listening from around the world. Does it sound like Wolf Blitzer? My name is not Wolf, but English Jenkins. I work as a Senior Program Officer at the Geneva office of the UN Non-Governmental Liaison Service. And we thought of organizing this briefing, given the fact that these negotiations under the UN General Assembly will begin next week. So for this, we have two eminent panelists. We have Eric Lecomte, who's the Executive Director of Jubilee USA Network, and Chantaline Carpentier, who's the Chief of the New York office of the UN Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD. The GA resolution that decided to start this process actually asked UNCTAD to act as the Prime Secretariat and use its long-standing knowledge and experience around finding ways in which to resolve sovereign debt problems. I mean, these problems date back probably to the first sovereign debt crisis that probably happened many centuries ago. I can't remember whether it was Holland or France that was hit first, but it's only since the 1997-98 East Asian crisis that this issue became quite a prominent topic on the global agenda. It picked up steam until the year 2000 and then petered off. There were a number of proposals for a debt restructuring mechanism that never made it through. And in recent times, as our colleagues will explain, there's been an increasing, let's say, depth of debt crisis that we used to think that it was primarily a problem of developing countries, but after the global financial crisis that hit Southern Europe particularly strongly, this is increasingly seen as a shared problem of both developing and developed countries. So we'll first have a detailed account of why this issue is so important and how it can affect the future sustainable development agenda from Eric Lecomte, and then we'll hear from Chantaline about modalities of participation, including from civil society. So without further ado, Eric, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Hamish. It's great to be with all of you today and to be discussing such an exciting concept as sovereign debt. I know generally exciting and sovereign debt don't usually find each other in the same sentence, but with how important this particular issue is and the fact that the UN is beginning negotiations next week, it's an issue that we very much need to pay attention to and be conscious of. In my remarks today, what I would like to share with you is why this particular issue is important. And then to go in a little bit about what a bankruptcy framework might look like. And then I'd like to close with, you used to say $1 million question, but it's really $1 billion question. And it's $1 billion question for the upcoming negotiations is how successful can the negotiations be? How successful can we be in actually starting to implement or create a framework if there are countries that represent some of the primary financial jurisdictions around the world who refuse to be a part of the negotiation. And so I think that's the $1 billion question that I'll close with. But first, let me start off with some remarks and frame the issue. Inequality is now a global problem. The world's 80 wealthiest people own as much wealth as the poorest 3.6 billion people combined. More than 1.2 billion people, 1 in 5 people who live in the world, live in extreme poverty. and 2.7 billion people live on less than $2 a day. Inequality was exacerbated by the 2008 financial crisis. According to the World Bank, nearly 100 million people, disproportionately women and children, fell into extreme poverty. The International Monetary Fund continues to report that recovery since the financial crisis, open quotes, uneven. And those who were pushed into extreme poverty by the financial crisis are still trapped in extreme poverty. Those who had nothing to do with causing the global financial crisis were those who bore the brunt of its consequences. The global financial crisis and ultimately inequality are the products of three interconnected failures in the international financial system. Number one, persistent and growing debt crisis. Number two, speculative high-risk investment. And number three, revenue shortfalls. Much of the world, especially the world's poorest people, have yet to recover from the global financial crisis. Just like inequality, financial crisis is a global problem and requires a global solution. In September, and in two votes in December, the United Nations responded with a global solution. The United Nations voted to begin negotiations on a framework for a global bankruptcy process. The process, once achieved, could limit defaults, it could lessen extreme speculative behavior, it could create stability in the global financial system, and perhaps most urgently, an international bankruptcy process could prevent the next regional or global financial crisis from ever happening. Over the last year and a half, the International Monetary Fund has also produced three papers that promote aspects of a global bankruptcy framework. The global financial crisis demonstrated both the need for reform and the risk of the current system. There is a global consensus on the causes of the global financial crisis, but we have yet to win global consensus on a comprehensive solution. The IMF, and in particular, the UN actions in support of a global framework, move us further towards this important consensus. Before diving into what a framework looks like, it's important for us to understand the extent of the problem. In our credit-based market system, debt is at the center of all of these challenges. The International Monetary Fund states that sovereign indebtedness is the root cause of global inequality. This is particularly true as debt crises spread from the global south to the global north. Recent Greek elections illustrate the reality that many of the same failed bank and IMF policies that plagued developing countries now negatively impact the developed world. In Greece, for instance, over-indebtedness led to an austerity program that increased both poverty and debt levels. In the 4 years following austerity implementation, unemployment in Greece more than doubled, and youth unemployment reached 50%. Almost 1/3 of all Greeks now live below the poverty line, and the economy contracted for 20 straight fiscal quarters in a row. Debt levels are higher now than before austerity. Greece is now the 3rd most indebted country in the world. Speculative financial behavior targets countries in crisis. Predatory hedge funds seized on Greece's problems to seek large profits. A so-called vulture fund bought distressed Greek bonds on the secondary market at reduced cost and then refused to participate in the restructuring. Greece paid in full these vulture funds to avoid potential litigation, and domestic investors took a large hit in the restructuring, further dampening Greece's economy. In Argentina, which has also been in the news, predatory funds pursued quadruple-digit profit margins on defaulted Argentine bonds, buying the bonds for pennies on the dollar and suing for full repayment in U.S. courts. The suit led eventually to a second Argentine default and the potential dismantling of Argentina's debt restructuring. The U.S. Supreme Court allowed a lower court ruling in favor of the hedge funds to stand. potentially giving predatory actors a global precedent to wield against poor countries and prey off of financial crisis. These actions not only threaten poor country revenues, they put debt restructuring and poor country access to credit at risk. Poor countries are indeed impacted most severely by these issues. Ebola-impacted West African countries struggled to fund basic services even before the epidemic struck. Low healthcare spending potentially worsened the epidemic and led to unnecessary loss of life. In 2012, the year before the epidemic began, Guinea, where the outbreak started, spent more money on debt than on public health. Over the past decades, Guinea, Sierra Leone, Liberia lost an annual combined average of $1.3 billion additionally to illicit financial flows. From 2006 to 2008, Guinea lost an estimated 16% of its budget to just one form of these flows, trade disinvoicing. In 2012, the three countries spent just under $300 million on public health and nearly $170 million on debt. Liberia is ranked 175th out of 187 countries in the United Nations Index in Human Development. Guinea is 179 and Sierra Leone is 183. Guinea, Sierra Leone, Liberia, Argentina, and Greece are victims of unsustainable debt, defaults, predatory behavior, steep austerity measures, and debt restructuring that has gone awry. These countries are not alone. From Iceland to Grenada and as El Salvador approaches a new debt restructuring, default has become too common and debt restructuring too frequent. The solutions to these economies in crisis are also the solutions for staving the next global financial crisis. And this brings us to mapping out the solution, a global bankruptcy framework. The idea of a fair and transparent arbitration process or a sovereign debt workout mechanism would, in a sense, create an international bankruptcy process, allowing a lender or borrower to work through a process with open and transparent rules, allowing both entities to negotiate a workout in the best interests of both parties. As noted, the international bankruptcy process is critical to halting predatory behavior, preventing financial crisis, promoting stability in the financial system, reducing debt burdens, encouraging responsible lending and borrowing. Processes like this in most domestic economies ensure predictability in a domestic economy, such as in the United States. A bankruptcy process similar to U.S. Chapter 11 would be in the best interest of both the lender and the borrower. A process like this would ensure that all debt holders sit at the table during a debt restructuring. The processes at the IMF and the comprehensive UN negotiations, which are set to begin next week, shows beyond concern for poor countries. It also shows concern for middle-income countries and realizes the concern that there's a great concern for how the entire financial system operates. A global bankruptcy process, similar to what Adam Smith, the father of modern economics, argued for, would instill global financial stability. An effective international bankruptcy process has the following characteristics: impartiality in decision-making and situated in a neutral forum away from interested creditors, interested lenders, interested debt holders. It should be one single insolvency process that involves all lenders, all creditors, and all forms of debt holders. A process, a framework, should account for human needs when assessing debt sustainability. Audits should take place of debt, promote responsibility in future lending and borrowing. Impartial assessment of the validity of individual claims as well as the legitimacy of the loans. So, if a loan was taken to build a bridge and a bridge was never built, that should be looked into the legitimacy of whether or not that loan was used for the purposes intended. A process should be inclusive and transparent, that includes civil society stakeholders, but more specifically, those affected by decisions should be included in the process. And finally, there should be an automatic stay on loan enforcement once a case has been filed. So once a case is going to be arbitrated, there should be a stay on enforcement. And this particular idea is also endorsed by one of the International Monetary Fund's most recent papers on these issues. These principles essentially reflect the leading principles of corporate or individual insolvency laws in nations all over the world. Debt audits are particularly critical. They can serve as deterrents to future reckless lending and thus prevent future crises. A bankruptcy process situated in a neutral forum would advance efforts to audit past debts for legitimacy and cancel debts that did not promote the public interest. Debt restructuring must also promote economic growth and revenue enhancement rather than harmful austerity measures. Those measures are often mandatory aspects of IMF restructurings and lead to low growth and increased poverty and debt. Currently, 70% of the world's poor are women and children. IMF policies that lead to cuts in health services, education, and public employment especially hurt women, who are often the first to be fired and the last to go to school. Therefore, our work on broad-based reforms will directly affect those most vulnerable from global economic policies. In addressing the need for such a process, the following points are important to explore, points that were even relevant before the last global financial crisis. Number one, low-income countries face new risk of debt distress. Number two, middle-income and developed countries face debt crises. And finally, three, restructuring debt has become much more complicated. So first, low-income countries face new risk of increasing debt distress. The IMF reports a high risk for 27 countries of debt distress, 16 of which are low-income. Middle-income countries and developed countries also face debt crises. 14 middle-income countries faced critically high indicators or high debt vulnerability. The recent Greek debt crisis, moreover, demonstrates that even developed countries are not immune from state insolvency. And finally, restructuring debt has become more complicated. The broad spectrum of creditors and lending instruments has broadened in recent years. Some emerging economies, even Eastern Europe, developing countries are now themselves becoming lenders to other foreign countries. New debt can come in the form of new types of bonds, through traditionally syndicated loans by commercial banks, through a new wave of credit from export credit agencies, or the greatly expanded multilateral post-crisis lending. As noted, other official lenders and investors. Traditional debt restructuring, therefore, is now less effective in dealing with all these actors. You know, one of the particular issues that we support in terms of having more comprehensiveness and protections in lending is this idea of collective action clauses. And certainly after the crisis with Argentina, we see that as being one of three important tools for dealing with debt distress. I think, however, the shortfalls of collective action clauses is that they don't deal with all debt comprehensively, and it only deals with certain types of debt. And for many of the global issues we're facing right now, we won't see any collective action clauses really have any powerful impacts in contracts for probably 10 years at least to come. So these are all indicators for the need for a single global bankruptcy framework that is comprehensive in terms of dealing with all the different types of credit that are out there. So let me close by getting to the billion-dollar question. And this will also lead us into Chantel speaking about the modalities and what we can expect next week and then April and during the sessions to come. I think those of us who've been following what's happening all realize that in the 3 votes that have taken place to move forward with the bankruptcy framework, There has been a range between 11 countries to 16 countries who have voted against the the United Nations negotiating a framework. It's important to note that although several of these countries do support some aspects of this process in the International Monetary Fund, these particular countries do represent some of the most powerful financial jurisdictions on planet Earth. So if we have loans being contracted in New York, in Japan, in Australia, in the UK, in Paris, and Frankfurt, if we're talking about some of the most powerful financial jurisdictions around the world, and these countries right now are not involved in the process or are threatening to try to challenge aspects of the process, you know, the question is a very legitimate question about the upcoming framework negotiations. Is with these countries, and I have to use the pun, holding out from fully participating in negotiations. Can we expect some reasonable outcomes for the process that's starting now? And my assessment is not only should we expect it, but that we should work to have every effort possibly made to make sure that what comes out of this framework is as powerful and as instrumental as possible. And this is important for several reasons. Beyond the fact that this is a global conversation and we're continuing to move towards a global solution, we have to understand that what can come out of these negotiations actually could have real impacts for countries all over the world in terms of how they deal with debt, how they deal with default, and how they deal with debt restructurings. Even if at the end of the day, the 7 or 8 financial jurisdictions that we would like to be a part of this process decide not to be a part of the process. And these are some of the pieces that I think are really important for us to understand. Right now, China and Russia are among several countries that have endorsed the process and are participating very actively in the framework. Among the other G77 countries and the other countries that are supporting the process, there's also other lenders and certainly borrowers among those groups. So whatever is moved forward in a framework, in a treaty process, could have very real multilateral implications for countries that agree to the framework. So it's the first step, the first process to dealing, at least between those countries, between those governments that decide on moving forward, that they can comprehensively deal with these issues multilaterally or within just a framework that involves these countries. And we have to understand how important that is. And that's why I call this a billion-dollar question, not a million-dollar question, is because for some of the most indebted countries of the world that subscribe to this process, they could still not only find relief, but also move forward with positive debt restructurings or positive restructuring processes that make their economies more stable long-term. And finally, we need to understand that within countries that get behind a framework like this, whether it's a treaty or agreement or however it moves forward, however it's final, it also encourages a high level of responsible lending and borrowing. And even that will have an ex-ante effect. That's the big economist word for before. It'll even have an effect on countries that don't subscribe to the framework because countries and lenders, knowing that there are these other frameworks out there, are going to be much more apt to be following responsible standards of lending and borrowing because they know there are other processes that could affect their holdings. So, in closing, I say that, the billion-dollar question, the answer is this process is incredibly important, and ultimately this process can end up with some very big impacts that for organizations like Jubilee USA really believe in, because we know that it can change the lives of people that are living in extreme poverty all over the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric. I think you've outlined extremely well why this process is so important and how it can affect the future of sustainable development, poverty, job creation, So now with these words, I think we need to turn to the practical matters of the modalities for these negotiations, including participation of civil society. So Chantaline from UNCTAD, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you already for the great introduction and several things that the Secretary can say to me. It's a pleasure to be here, see old faces from colleagues when I used to be on the other side of the road and working with civil society. As Eric mentioned, we had a resolution that was only adopted on the 29th of December to go ahead with this ad hoc committee on the sovereign debt restructuring. Therefore, unfortunately, we do not have a program of work in front of you because, given that the resolution was only adopted on the 29th of December, we still do not have a review. The way these committee work within the UN is we would have each regional group of each of the world, is one of them, that would nominate somebody to represent that regional group, so you have a balanced group. We are still in the process of identifying those. The President of the General Assembly's office is working on that. We're having a meeting tomorrow morning with, which looks like will be the chair, because that's the only group that has submitted a country to represent them, which is Colombia, to discuss the composition of the bureau and looking at the draft program of work that UNCTAD and our colleagues at PESA and others have been working on. In terms of the session, it's going to be going on. The first one is going to be 3 sessions. The resolution calls for 3 sessions that will consist of 1 meeting. That means there's only 1 official document in the 3rd session. That caused problem because we were talking with our Francophone colleagues yesterday. That means that these documents will not be translated in Spanish or French in the meantime because they are not official documents until the end of the session. So we will be looking forward to work with colleagues that can help with that, including our colleague at NGLS. In terms of what I can tell you in terms of the program of work, however, is that we have a keynote speaker that it looks like it will be agreed upon by the bureau, or what we're going to have at the bureau. The bureau has to have at least 3 members. We hope that by tomorrow we're going to have at least 2, and then hopefully by the end of the session next week we'll have 3. It looks like Professor Ocampo has agreed to be a keynote speaker, and he will be on the agenda on the first day after we do the first adoption of the agenda and organization matters. So that would be an interesting dialogue to have with Professor Ocampo. I think a lot of you have heard on these issues. And then we're going to have general discussion. That's when member states and the groups come in with their statement, general statement about what they expect out of this process. So that first session where we know that the group G77, for instance, will come up with their statement. We expect, and you can go on our website on the debt portal of UNCTAD, and you will see the elements that have already been submitted by Sri Lanka, by Argentina. Several of you have submitted input as well. And these will be the opportunity for member states and the groupings and the civil society and private sector to present those general statements. We probably will have quite a bit of time on Monday afternoon for civil society and private sector interaction. Tuesday. Did it say Monday? I'm so sorry. Thursday. The first day on the 3rd. Yes. Feel free to interrupt me. So we expect, because there's not going to be a lot of member state, or maybe not all member states will want to submit statement, we expect to have quite a bit of time in civil society. So NGLS has sent a call for interest in speaking because we still need, this is GA format, so we need to collect the interest for speaking and then bring them to the secretariat, where the UNCTAD is a substantive secretariat, but there's the secretariat that does the seating arrangement and supporting of the bureau, and we need to bring those expressions to them, and then it's going to be the chair that will decide who to call on and when. But we do expect to have time for a statement on Tuesday afternoon. Then what has been proposed, and of course these are propositions that we hope will be adopted tomorrow, so please bear with me because they may still change. there should be a session on resolving economic dispute multilaterally. So basically, lesson from experience, a little bit of what Eric has talked about. What is happening out there? Why is it happening? What are the gaps? And some of the solutions. We're going to have panel discussion, followed by interactive dialogue. We expect a few civil sector to be able to also interact with the Bureau and the member states. Then we have proposed another session on the gaps in the current restructuring system. Then another panel session on options for moving forward. Another one on standstill, rollover, and write-off. All these technical terms that you can ask Eric to explain to you if you want to. And then a debt restructuring historical perspective. So going back to the historical perspective on Thursday, in the morning, before we go back in the afternoon to decide on the rest of the member state would like to have. And what is the process? Are we going to have any activities in between the meetings, or is just going to be during these 3-day meeting that activity will be ongoing? Also, the question of what do we do with the elements that we received online? How do we compile those? And when and do we have a zero draft? And if so, when? And how do we prepare? So these are all the issues that will be discussed at closing session at Thursday. So that's kind of general about the program of work, and then Amish did send, and Susan did send to all of the lists. So if you haven't received it, you'll see them a call for interest. We will also, to support this ad hoc committee, have at Columbia University at the end of March a meeting with Professor Stiglitz on 2 items. One is the debt restructuring mechanism that UNCTAD has been working on, with the IMF and other parties, to discuss that, as well as what Eric was alluding to, which are the principles of responsible lending and borrowing that UNCTAD has put forward and that several member states have signed on. So that workshop will be at the end of March in Columbia, and we hope that it's going to help bring some of these materials together. In terms of continued modalities, we are very gracious to UN-NGLS that have agreed to issue passes for people that will need them to access, that are not don't have their accreditation, that are accredited but don't have their passes. Back to UNCTAD, anybody who are accredited to UNCTAD, to the FFD committee, to the FFD process, and to ECOSOC are allowed to participate and engage in the process. And it's actually welcome. The only constraint that we have at this point is because this is a GA setting again. That means, and we're in the Trusteeship Council. There's 193 member states, there's 3 observers, that's 196, and that's about the size of the room with microphone. So there's only an extra 4 microphones for civil society and private sector. So amongst ourselves, we would have to decide on the order that you speak, and then have you come to the gallery to come to those seats and alternate in the seats so that we can facilitate participation. So I think I will close here, and maybe just entertain questions.
Excellent. Just one point of clarification. It is, as you mentioned, it's NGOs who are accredited to ECOSOC, who have observer status with UNCTAD, and those who are accredited to past financing for development conferences and their follow-up mechanisms, because the accreditation for the upcoming financing for development conference hasn't yet begun. So with that, I'll open the floor for questions. If you could please introduce yourself.
However, we are quite aware of the significance of this matter, and our organization tries to say, sometimes we take different points of the United States government, association at ABA, and state bar association, now state bar association, which are the domestic law litigation, especially many of people here may be aware of that this was a very unique type of opinion, but statutes are, even with the United States government has not included in the foreign maybe in the lawsuit in the United States court, that's against the value of that's those are possible. I reviewed all the same submissions already, and part of them is special interest and written by the independent expert of the human rights council. The United States already signed the Economic Social and Cultural Rights Convention, so that the United States is not allowed to do the council to have the review before the application and establish that's the background. So I'm sorry for that. My question, David's question is the expected outcome of these three meetings. The reason I'm asking is because I might think unscripted treaty negotiation on the first conference in July 2012. Because there was no contact in Russia, they said. So Mexico and other countries have been part of the VA before 2012, and they were smart. But the resolution was that if the next conference was not able to get to the just then that case may be brought to the UN General Assembly before. This was exactly what very good important. March 2013, ADP second conference. Again, was not able to come to the consensus because of three nations blocked. But one day after the final day of the conference, the General Assembly voted with both 155 to 3, and then ADP was adopted, and within 18 months, that treaty went into force. So that's, and again, another lesson we can learn from the civil societies in the previous 20 years, from a very strong, solid, group of arms control group, and not really push the member states and the United States even to sign the treaty. But that's a very great what we can learn from the experience. So I'm wondering, based on the experience, you try to encourage the member states not to be bound by the consensus-based negotiations. That civil society many people feeling that they were abused of the consensus and ruled by a small number of states. But many states were negotiated even without the argument presenting a family. But the state played a very important role to be in that that's what the lesson from the ADP negotiation.
Yeah, I think we got your point. Thank you very much. I don't know if I think Eric tried to answer it already in his $1 billion question bit, but maybe you want to add a few words to that.
Sure.
No one has a crystal ball, so we don't know what will happen. But I guess part of the point that I want to convey is that even in spite of the reality that some of the most important financial jurisdictions will not play a positive role in these negotiations, that the potential for what could happen would still have significant global impacts on how countries relate with one another, how debt restructurings take place, on moving forward and promoting principles of responsible lending and borrowing, and actually, have a part in impacting extreme poverty and inequality around the world. So, we don't know, what will happen, when we get to September, but I think right now it's crucial that those of us that are invested in this process do as much as possible to move forward the strongest framework possible that can be agreed upon, even if it's only 130 countries that agree to the framework. And there are other countries that stand outside of whatever framework happens.
Okay. Any other questions? Yes?
How do you see the timing on this in light of the coming ADIS meeting and the framework development? Will there be a possibility of interfacing at some point the new dynamic if that comes forth into what is happening in ADIS?
Yeah, well, obviously the debt issues are on the FFD agenda, so the question is actually quite a good one. So I don't know if you have any insight on that.
Maybe I want to compliment, but if you look at the resolution, there's a reason why the 3 meetings are January, May, June, July. It's because they hope to have this work completed before the ADIS conference. So it's never been said explicitly, but if you look at the dates, there's a reason that these are meetings in this order in this very short time frame. In terms of your question, sir, we don't know. We've been working on this since December 29. We still have no idea what the outcomes will look like. We're going to know after these first 3 days. Maybe after the first day and a half, we'll know. We'll know, as it says, who's engaging and who's not engaging, and then what is it that member states expect to get out of this, because we have no idea.
I have another question. At one point, I think UNCTAD recently told me that there is sometimes a lack of agreement among some of the G77 members as they present themselves in Geneva and here, and we're going to be trying, I guess, to get some help to get some more unanimity among the G77 members. Has any of that happened?
I can just say that one of the former UNCTAD chief economists noted that there was a significant difference between the situation back in 98, 99, when these things were discussed, where there was absolutely no consensus within the G77. UNCTAD had worked really hard to try and show the importance of that, but they were really split. Because I think since the 2009 crisis conference has been a significant evolution of that. So I don't know if there are still some blockages. I haven't followed the recent negotiations, but maybe Eric or Chantal have some insight.
From our side, when we met with the G77 chair, we were told that for once the G77 is pretty unified on this issue. So that's what we're going with. And we'll see when the G77 is still under the South African chairpersonship, is preparing their statement. So once they have their statement, we'll see pretty clearly where we go. But it seems like they're pretty unified at this point. And Russia has already subscribed to be speaking, so we know they're engaged.
I guess let me just I think go back to the point there was a question asked a moment ago about I believe it was the financial jurisdictions. No, excuse me, the external debt question that was raised. Sorry, there's a lot going on there right now. So and in terms of the FFD process, so I think what was shared in terms of the dates is really important, and I think we need to acknowledge that right now there is a pretty active debate that's happening behind closed doors around the FFD process right now about how debt should be mentioned, and there's no doubt among some of the countries that voted against the UN resolution around the framework that although they support some aspects of the bankruptcy process, they don't believe the United Nations should have anything to do with it. They believe it should take place at the IMF, even the most forward thinking, of the 16 that voted against the process. So I think also just to mention, I think in terms of the FFD process, I think there's something very similar right now that's happening behind closed doors around debt. And Although the co-chairs initial draft, there was a lot of really incredible work put into it. I would say some of the analysis that has been offered around that process so far has, it has illustrated that there are groups that are trying to get debt watered down in the FFD process. At the same time, we've continued to see in the notes and information, the bankruptcy process acknowledged. But I think that's also something that's going to happen concurrently with the FFD process, that with how important debt is and because the basis of the conversation, we need to be very strong in ensuring that in the final outcome document, it not only illustrates the prominence of debt, it not only promotes transparency and accountability around debt restructuring processes, but I think it's also imperative for us to try and push to have support for something like a bankruptcy framework in the final FFD agreements as well. And so I think right now, and I know the next conversation this afternoon on the floor will be around some of the external debt issues, but I think even some of the name changes that we've seen from, instead of referring to it as external debt, breaking down issues around sovereign debt, it's very clear that there is a debate going on right now where there are some countries that want to see this kind of focus on debt removed from various UN processes, including the FFD process.
I have a question. I mean, your initial presentation was very expert, and I guess people who are not following this that closely might have been puzzled. There's one question I have. If there's not buy-in from some of the major financial jurisdictions that you alluded to earlier, but there is an agreement with a critical mass of countries, including some of the creditors, does it mean that the framework would only apply to future bonds that might be issued within the terms of this framework? In other words, for example, the case of Argentina. I mean, Argentina was prepared to pay the 90% creditors who were willing to be paid, but the money was blocked the money was paid to a US bank, but they received instructions from the US legal system not to disperse the money until the odd few that were described as vulture funds paid 100% of the original bond value plus interest. So my question is, if there's still small print in existing somewhere else, would that framework allow to resolve those debt problems, or only future bond issues? If you follow my question.
Right. So, how comprehensive can a process be? And I think that gets to a question in part that we don't know the answer to. We don't know what framework will be agreed upon come September. But let's assume two things. Let's assume it's the most bold framework possible that looks at issues in terms of the comprehensiveness of all debt. And let's also assume that there are some countries that are important financial jurisdictions that don't sign on or don't agree to that final framework. So, under that scenario, what it would mean is if, the country of Grenada, the Caribbean island, where 40% of the people live in poverty, if 3 years from now they get hit with a hurricane, they go through another debt restructure, it would mean that if this was a framework that was agreed upon in some kind of treaty sense or signed on to as a multilateral agreement between those countries, it would mean for Grenada that they would be able to negotiate their debts in a fair and transparent way with other countries that have signed on. So if China signs on, China had offered initial support. So, for Grenada and China that would be very important, for both countries. If Grenada has loans from Japan, and they are one of the countries that says we will not sign on to this framework, well then what it means is they have to deal with those loans separately. So, I think another piece which is going to be really interesting, if this process does develop into a process that is actually a powerful framework between those countries that actually sign on to it, it could mean long term that both borrowers and lenders decide as much as possible to work with countries that agree on that framework and not go outside of that framework. Now that's easily, that's much more easier said than done. With the reality that, of course, also the countries that hold some of the most prominent jurisdictions are also some of the most important lenders. But I think what it does mean is that over time, groups like the Paris Club and even the IMF and others will have less importance the more that this kind of framework moves forward and has strength, and the more that even countries that agree to that framework can agree on loan deals amongst themselves. So that's part of, I think, where this could really move, but at the same time, if some of the financial jurisdictions that have raised concerns, if they don't sign on, it wouldn't necessarily, allow Grenada to be able to move forward in a better, more responsible debt restructuring with Japan. But with everyone else that has debt deals with, it would.
One clarification is what is the one procedure question, and what is exactly legal procedure for a committee? Is it allowed to make a voting, or it is supposed to come to consensus? And the reason is because last week there was similar multilateral, say negotiation on the pre-negotiation for, say what it is marine biodiversity, potential convention, and the ad hoc committee has been working for the last 2 years, and then that committee seemed to be under consensus-based kind of procedure. But if this upcoming ad hoc committee works in a similar way as the second or third committee of the main committee, then again there will be a vote, and that will significantly change the dynamics of the negotiations. So if you know about this kind of issue, I just know. And it's going to be more substantive comment. It's probably comment on the question like last September there was a joint meeting, briefing of second committee and ECOS. I went there, and then there was somebody talked about the practical impact because our netting situation here was in charge of the initial system works so unbelievably against the so that there was discussion already that since New York's judicial system is so unreasonable, so somebody was already talking to move the international bond business to London or something like that. That's a kind of very interesting kind of practical side. And in the upcoming years, if more monies are sitting in Chinese investors than in the United States, the BRICS country may set up, try to establish Hong Kong as a global center of the issuing, and then even that kind of quote itself really scared New York's financial industry. I know about it. So I just want to comment on this future change with the shift of the may actually work from this one of the countries around the countries to maybe
Okay, thank you. Well, first there was a procedural question. This ad hoc committee was created by vote, so Nathalie, do you have any comments?
No, it was created by vote. It's going to create its outcome document by July, and we'll see it submitted hopefully to the FFD process and to the post-2015 process, and then we'll see.
Also, just to, I think further address how this process, if implemented in a strong way, could further address the holdout countries that don't go along, with the process. I made remarks that it could increase responsibility around lending and borrowing within those financial jurisdictions. But I think also, as more countries sign on or are part of a framework, it would probably also lead to additional law changes and protections, which might not look like insolvency, but certainly create a higher level of transparency and accountability in how loans are contracted in those financial jurisdictions. I think the last thing, I would say, and certainly among many of those in civil society who have worked on this, it's been a fairly important principle that it be in a neutral forum, like the UN or another entity that's not a creditor. I will say that, I heard at a very high level at the International Monetary Fund that they took notice of that vote in September. And I believe it's already propelling additional action at the IMF that we'll see in the spring. So you also have to understand that even outside of the very real ways, if this is strong, it can potentially impact the world and certainly those living in extreme poverty. We also have to acknowledge that if it is strong, it will continue to have a catalytic effect, not only in financial jurisdictions, but also in the major financial institutions of our day, like the IMF.
Could you please?
Yeah, Fabien Berthaud from French Ministry of Economy, but it's my question, the question of the ministry. Yeah, that's important. Just one question on the mandate and the option considered by the committee. It's about a global framework, but will you consider other approaches or other options, other works? And I'm thinking about the IMF works on the contractual approach, for example.
Well, I could start by offering my personal opinion. Our opinion, well, my personal, the opinion of the organization that I work for, Jubilee USA, we welcome anything that moves forward the conversation. So we very much, and that's specifically talking about deterring the predatory behavior and those collective action clauses that the IMF and the International Capital Markets Association and the U.S. Treasury have all endorsed. In terms of stopping predatory behavior, we think collective action clauses are helpful. We think they're a step in the right direction. As the IMF acknowledges in its most recent paper on this, the problem with collective action clauses is it's not going to have an impact for a decade, and it doesn't deal with all forms of debt. And that's the really important piece. So it just deals with bond, but we have to understand there's global agreement, 100% consensus right now with everyone except for the so-called vulture funds that kind of behavior shouldn't exist. And so, the U.S. government, along with the International Capital Markets Association, the IMF have all said we need stronger collective action clauses. And so we think that's great, but it's not enough to deal with the problem and how we need to have a comprehensive solution around the problem. And so that in addition to collective action clauses, this is, again, just dealing with the predatory behavior. We also need to see laws passed in financial jurisdictions that deter the behavior. And we think that's something, I'm somewhat optimistic that over the next few years, we're going to see more of those laws pass. And then, of course, the big solution, which not only deals with the predatory behavior, but also limits default, creates global economic stability, and most importantly, could be what prevents the next global financial crisis, is a global insolvency framework. And right now, in terms of that debate, collective action clauses are great. They're a step in the right direction, but it doesn't do enough to deter the behavior. Laws passed in financial jurisdictions would do the trick mostly, but the most comprehensive approach, of course, is the international bankruptcy framework. Did I answer your question?
I have another question, actually a couple of questions. The first one is, you work in you campaign around the world, but I guess you work quite strongly politicians in the United States. And I know from the history of Jubilee US, you work in a completely bipartisan way. So I'd be curious to know in your work in Congress whether there is buy-in for all the arguments that you've made between both political parties. And then another political question, with the recent elections in Greece, where the current party that had the majority of votes had announced that they would do an audit of their debt, which I think is within the legal framework of the European Union. What do those elections have as an effect, maybe, on this process?
Those are really great questions. And, Jubilee USA, for those of you who may not know us, we were an organization that was founded primarily by the religious community in the United States, by groups like the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, American Jewish World Service. Essentially, almost all the Big Ten mainline churches are part of our membership in the United States, as well as, we also have membership which includes the largest labor unions in the United States, as well as various political and advocacy groups. But, we really look at our work, and it comes from that religious tradition, as being about building an economy that serves, protects, and promotes the participation of the most vulnerable. And our analysis and assessment has certainly instructed us that the way you do that and the way that you do that continuously is by addressing the financial policies that trap people in poverty. And the reality of it is, it's debt, tax, and trade policies that are the reason right now that we have extreme poverty. If it wasn't for those policies right now, I wouldn't say poverty wouldn't exist, but extreme poverty would no longer exist, right? And that's really important, to look at that reality. And so that's our intersection. Also, with that said, it's been very important for us to engage and work with the broadest community possible. And that's a very important part of who we are as a religious community, that idea of engagement. And so Congressional Quarterly continues to cite the efforts of Jubilee USA as one of the last standing bipartisan coalitions in the United States, which I know for some might not be much of an accolade right now, but it's certainly something. And that bipartisanship on all these issues is really important. So when we've introduced reviews of an international bankruptcy process previously in Congress as a part of the Jubilee Act on Responsible Lending and Borrowing, which moves forward some of the very same principles developed by UNCTAD on responsible lending and borrowing that Jubilee was a part of helping to develop. When that passed, we also had what passed, and again, that was introduced by Republicans and Democrats, a sense of the Congress in support of international bankruptcy process. So that wasn't binding, but it illustrated, some support. It's very clear right now in the United States, not only in the White House, but among both parties, they support aspects of the process, but it wouldn't be accurate to characterize their position at this point as fully endorsing it, and certainly not endorsing it taking place within the UN system. So, that piece of bipartisanship continues to be really important for us on all the policies we work for, because, for Jubilee, we don't represent parties, we don't represent governments. We're there to represent the people who too often are not at the table, and those are the voices of the most vulnerable people. And it's interesting how that connects to the Greek question, around audits. I think one of the most interesting things and most underreported pieces around the Greek election is that the coalition government that formed from an extreme left party and an extreme right party, certainly very conservative party. And that's the new coalition government. And what they have in common is concerns about austerity, concerns about the debt restructuring. And we have to understand that things like audits, debt audits, accountability, transparency, these don't originate, although they've certainly been, certainly supported by progressive communities. These are all core ideals which come from conservative communities first. And so that's really important, the idea of accountability, of auditing, of saving money, of spending money. And when you spend money, you spend it on what you say you're going to spend it on. These are core conservative principles. And so it's interesting right now to see in Greece, you have the left and the right coming together on an agenda that they agree on. An agenda which actually is very similar to the Jubilee Act on responsible lending and borrowing, that's supported by both strong conservatives, moderates, and progressives in the US Congress. In terms of what that might look like for Greece, in terms of an audit, it has to be the first step in terms of determining their history. And it's actually quite remarkable that they say they need an audit. You would assume that these processes have taken place, and certainly aspects of them have taken place through the various debt restructurings. But I think for the people to fully understand what loans were taken, at what rates, and for what, is incredibly important. So for them to put that front and center, from our point of view, is the first step in any of these issues. It's an auditing, it's an accounting. And that's also partly why we believe an international bankruptcy framework is so important, because it forces transparent and accountable audits to take place. Debts shouldn't be resolved, they shouldn't be arbitrated until we know what the debts are. Doesn't even sound crazy that we'd even say something like that, until we know what the debts are. That in the global financial system, we are missing rules and regulations that exist in almost all of our domestic economies to protect us around lending and borrowing. But these things are absent from the international financial system. That a country might not know what it actually owes a creditor or a lender.
Yeah, and actually we can see the effect of a debt audit with what Ecuador did under President Correa. They did an audit of the debt, and basically all the illegitimate debt they decided not to pay. Somehow they managed to get away with it, but it really freed up a lot of resources for one of the fastest growing countries in Latin America, with the fastest human development performer according to UNDP. So that does say something about the link between debt issues and sustainable development. Chantaline, you wanted to say something?
I just want to clarify, because I don't want to mislead people. I want to clarify, I don't want to mislead people. There will be a report, we expect a report to come out in July. However, the report will also be submitted to the GA in September, as I was saying. And then what we don't know is, if you look at the language, it's been changed several times, and it's basically for consideration, appropriate action. So we don't know exactly what does that mean. And to get back to Fabier's question, there are different panels, and there will be experts speaking on each of these panels. One on the gaps, especially in the contractual approach, which is the market-based approach, is pushed by the IMF, and a lot of countries are supporting, and that they're moving forward as they feel the pressure a little bit from these other systems. So oftentimes these things work through pressure somewhere else in the system. And then the second one is on, as I said earlier, the standstill, the rollover, and the write-off. So there are various, the system, as Eric says, is missing a lot of pieces. And is this framework going to, probably would suggest all of the pieces that would need to be part of that framework. And member state will have to decide if they choose 1, 2, 3, or all the pieces of the framework, or the whole framework. And then we'll see how that happens in the fall. Just want to clarify that.
Thank you. Actually, maybe they can all sign on to it and then have the reservations and paragraphs they disagree with. Okay, I think.
It's going to be really interesting to see what happens at the IMF in these past 3 papers, because there's no doubt the papers have all looked at aspects of a process where what the framework is attempting to do is be comprehensive, because you need all aspects, just like US Chapter 11. Yeah. So, but I mean, we will see action that will, in the financial system, move forward greater responsibility, and I believe it will happen more quickly because of the UN votes.
I just going to say that because for me, this is not an area that I knew a lot about until I joined UNCTAD. The reason we have Chapter 11 in the US Code is because the whole idea, just like with the automobile industry, is when a company is going into financial trouble, the idea is how can we all work together to put that company back into a sustainable path for growth and job creation and other things. And it is, as it says, pretty interesting that that same process, that same system does not exist for countries that borrow money to return them as quickly as possible in sustainable and growth path and job creation path. And I think it's an easy way to conceptualize it when you're not an expert in this field.
Well, and just to add, the beauty about Chapter 11, I know a lot of people are familiar with Chapter 9, Chapter 11, the different bankruptcy codes in the US, but the beauty about Chapter 11 is it's hardly ever used. So in other words, this is that big economist word again, ex ante, before. It has a before effect, that just by establishing it, it allows entities to work out deals among themselves before it ever gets to the higher level of the Chapter 11 process, right? And so that's what's important about this process as well, in this framework. And that's also how we need to understand the framework can impact those financial jurisdictions that don't sign on to it. That it could help them to clean up their own houses, even if they don't subscribe to a global bankruptcy framework.
The end of our session, and some people haven't had a chance to have lunch, so I propose to close the session now, and it's still unclear whether the debt issues will be dealt with in the late part of today's session, or whether it will be held tomorrow morning. I presume the way things are going, it's more likely that it will be tomorrow morning. So without further ado, this meeting is adjourned, and enjoy the rest of the day.